So we took care of the inward corner. Now let's look at outward corners. So we know how to do something when we have a inward facing corner. Now we've got outward facing corners. This one's going to be much faster. You should have this pattern, the outward corner pattern. Cut one from muslin, cut one from a contrast fabric. It is a symmetrical pattern, so it doesn't really matter whether you're cutting everything right side up or upside down. Here are my two pieces, one for muslin, one for my contrast fabric. Be sure to mark your seam allowances and clip your two notches. I've marked this seam allowance over here. This one's upside down. Yep, yeah, there we go. So those two have seam allowances marked on them, and they've got notches clipped at the top edge. I'm going to place these right sides together. So the right side of my contrast fabric is going to go right side down. I like to mark my seam allowance on the wrong sides of my fabric so I can see them while I'm sewing. And I'm just going to match these up, match up the corners, match up my notches, and pin this together. Now when we did the inward corner, we had to clip into our seam allowance in order to get our seam allowances all going in the same direction, but we don't have to do that here because everything's all lined up nice and neat and pretty. However, we do still need to put reinforcing stitches into here. Now you can absolutely sew this all together, sew this line, I'll show you on the pattern. You can sew this seam with a number 2 stitch all the way around, and it should be fine. But to get you in the habit of stitching your corners with garment construction, because this will get us ready for the next set of samples that we're going to do, I like to stitch at a number 2, and I'll just show you how I'm going to put this into the machine. I'm going to start over here, 1/2 inch away from my seam, from my raw edge. I'm going to stitch my back tack at a number 2, continue stitching with a number 2 stitch all the way down until I get close to this little corner. So similar to what we did before where we had a small little 1/2 inch corner, that little L shape that we stitched at a number 1 stitch on our inward corner, I'm going to do something similar. Maybe a 1/2 inch or so away from this corner, I'm just going to switch my stitch length. I'll stitch from a number 2 all the way down until about here where I'm going to switch to a number 1 stitch on my machine. And then I'll continue with a number 1 stitch, pivot in my corner, and then stitch out of that corner also on a number 1 stitch, and then change my stitch back to a number 2. These marks are arbitrary. I'm just eyeballing 1/2 inch. It doesn't have to be perfect. As long as you switch to a number 1 stitch in these corners, and then switch back out to a number 2 stitch. Because a number 1 stitch, while very secure, it's going to take longer to sew, and it's not going to be fun to rip out in case you make a mistake and have to redo it. So I would much rather just rip out this corner if I had to. It's going to be much easier to rip out a number 2 stitch out over here or down over here and just trying to struggle, just kind of struggle here in this corner. That's fine. But I'll switch out to a number 2 stitch, go all the way down, and then when I approach my next corner, I'll do the same thing. Switch out to a number 1 stitch, continue stitching to that corner, pivot, continue with a number 1 stitch as I stitch out of that corner, and then switch again to a number 2 stitch. You are more than welcome to change your stitch length in the middle of a seam. It happens very often in garment construction. So I'm going to head to the sewing machine. I'll actually stitch everything from the muslin side up so it's a little bit clearer to see where I'm stitching. And I'm just going to make some of those marks for myself as I approach those corners so I know when to switch my stitch length. So I'm starting on a number 2 stitch on my machine. I'm going to start at this rightmost edge back tack at the beginning. And back tack should only be about 2 or 3 stitches long. We don't need anything more than that or else we get big unsightly stitches. And I'm going to continue on a number 2 stitch all the way down. And as I approach this corner, I can see I'm getting close. Within about a 1/2 inch or so of that, I'm going to switch to a number 1 stitch. Tinier stitch is going to give me more dexterity as I get into this corner. And it's going to apply reinforcement as I stitch into this corner. There we go, pretty close there. Let me pivot my work. I think I can take one more tiny stitch to get me right into that corner. Good. Now I'll pivot. Continuing on a number 1 stitch, I'm going to stitch out of this corner for about a 1/2 inch, and then I'll switch off to a number 2 again. So switching back to a number 2 stitch, and I'll continue. Approaching my next corner, I'm going to slow down and stop about a 1/2 inch away, switching back to a number 1 stitch, stitching into the corner, locking my stitches so I can get it nice and precise. There we go. Pivot, stitch out on a number 1 stitch, stitching out of my corner, and about a 1/2 inch away, switching back to my number 2 stitch. And back tack at the end. Okay, so you can see where I started with the number 2 stitch. See how long those stitches are? You can see where I switched to a number 1 stitch, much smaller stitches. Stitched in and out of that corner with a number 1 stitch, switched back to a number 2 stitch, and as I approached the next corner, I switched again to number 1 stitch, stitching in and out of that corner on a number 1, and then continued the rest with a number 2 stitch. So remember, you can change stitch lengths in the middle of your stitching. We did it when we worked on our centered and lap zipper. We're going to do it again here, and you'll see it one more time when we start working on collars. So we've done the sewing that we need to, but now we've got some work that needs to get done to the seam allowance. What we essentially want to do is turn this work right side out, but let me show you what happens if I do that immediately. It's going to be a lot of bulk and whatnot. My corners are not going to be very crisp. I can kind of grab at this fabric and poke it out as much as I would like, but it's not going to give me nice crisp corners. There's too much bulk inside of here. There's too much seam allowance inside of there. That's what's causing my rounded corners. So similar to how we worked on the skirt when we finish off the waistband, we've got to remove some of the excess from these corners because there's just too much fabric going on up in here. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can really see what I'm doing. Here I'm zoomed in on this corner here. Just as we did before, I'm going to reduce my seam allowance. Now sometimes you will end up reducing all of your seam allowance, reducing this to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That really helps to reduce bulk. But for my corners specifically, I want to trim about 45 degrees off of this corner. I do not want to snip through my stitching though. So I'm going to give myself about 1/8 of an inch. So again, 1/8 of an inch is one of these squares on the clear ruler. So I'm going to place that 1/8 inch mark on my corner where I stitched. I'm going to place that 1/8 inch mark there and just kind of give myself a guideline for where I'm going to trim off this fabric. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I've got plenty of extra fabric, about 1/8 of an inch there. So once I snip this off, if this starts to fray or something, it shouldn't really affect my number 1 stitches in there. I'll just clip that away. Clipping through both layers, everything gets trimmed. And then, again, to help reduce even more bulk, I'm going to clip at an angle. It's a more obtuse angle, kind of reducing this fullness here. Just going to angle this down and clip all of this off. Same thing over here. Just kind of angle this up and clip all this excess off of here. So it helps reduce the extra bulk from the seam allowance that was here And then it helps kind of trim it down as we get closer to that corner. Again, clipping through all layers. There we go. That's much nicer, a lot less bulk, and I should be able to get a nice crisp corner when I turn this right side out. I'm going to do the same to the opposite corner over here. I'm not going to mark it this time though. I'm just going to eyeball it. Again, clipping this corner at about a 45-degree angle, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance, and then I will trim this down from either side. Okay, so we've trimmed off some excess material. Let's head to the iron and press this nice and flat. Remember to use your tailor's point. You're going to be able to get nice crisp seams. I'm going to press my seams open, place my tailor's point inside of there, get the point right there where the corner of my work is. Press these seams open first. Same thing over here. Now I'm not really going to be able to get my tailor's point across this top edge. That's okay. I'm just going to do my best to push those seams out to make them nice and clean finished. I'm going to grab my awl. I like to use my awl. You can use an awl, a seam ripper, the end of a pencil that doesn't have any lead in it, a mechanical pencil, totally fine. So these seams are now pressed open on the sides, and I'm going to turn my work right side out and kind of reach in here and poke these corners out as best I can. And my finger's only going to do so well, which is why I grab a sharp pointy object. I'm going to place that inside to help push those corners out. And again, you'll see me poke out my corners from the outside as well. Just be very careful when doing this. I'm going to try the end of my pen. Got my friction pen in here. That awl is a little too pointy for my taste. Poke these corners out. We should be able to get these nice and crisp and clean. And again, I'll be placing my awl in here, kind of pushing down on each of the corners. Placing it up in here and pushing up into the corners. Rather than just poking straight out, I'm actually poking to the side. Get them as close as possible, and whatever I can't poke out from the inside, I'll try to pull out from the outside. You can also roll the fabric up, use your fingernails. Just kind of roll this fabric up and get that seam line right up to where we're about to press. We should be able to see that seam. Now you're never going to get corners that are exact 90 degrees. There's always going to be a little bit of a curve to it, but much less so since we've trimmed our seam allowance. So this is looking a lot better than it was when we had all that bulk in there. Make sure this seam is rolled out so it's nice and clean. We don't want too much excess, and I'm going to press that. I don't want it rolling around too much. We press these seams out on the sides, so we should be able to just press this nice and flat. Okay. All right. Those are our outward corners taken care of. That's the process of clipping your seam allowance in preparation. Now I'm going to mark my muslin side so that you can see a little bit better. When we work on garments, you're normally going to finish something off like this, clean finish your edges, and then you're either going to understitch or top stitch. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Just for this sample, it's really to understand the trimming of the seam allowances. So this is my outward corners sample. So there should be an opening down here at the bottom where you can turn everything right side out and inside out. You've got your muslin side and your contrast fabric side.